So, official start. Welcome. So my name is Terry Fifield. I'm the current president of the Historical Society, the Plymouth Historical Society, and welcome to the Old Webster Courthouse. You're in a long line of people who've gathered here since 1774 for various reasons. And so welcome to our program tonight. I want to let you know these programs are offered throughout, well, from about March till usually early to November, or occasionally there's one in December, but we generally take a break in the middle of the winter. And so this is going to be an interesting talk tonight, one that people have been waiting for a long time. I did want to just talk to you about a couple of things. One is these days we're worried about funding and keeping our organization going and being able to fund these programs. So I'd like to ask you to think about donating and membership. If you'd like to join, we have membership forms on the table in the back. And we're always open to support in terms of volunteerism or donations. So there's a donation jar in the back, but you can go online to www.plymouthNHhistory.org and hit the support button, and they'll give you the opportunity to join or support at any level that you want to. So let's see. Of course, some of our programs throughout the year come with a cost. We have a generous speaker tonight who has foregone the fees and whatnot, but often we do have to pay for travel expenses and those kinds of things. So let's see, what else have I got? Well, I want to let you know about the exits. There are fire exits are the door you came in through, and then if it's burning back there, go charging through there, and there's a door on the right that I unlocked, and it opens out into the grassy yard behind here. And so you'd be able to go out that door and then collect in the street out front. So that's the protocol if something were to happen. Let's see. Of course, the bathroom is through that door and on the left. And you probably won't be using that. Let's see. So I want to, at this point, just, I'll introduce the speaker in a minute, but I wanted to turn this over to Marcia Schmidt-Lane for a few minutes. Marcia's on our program committee and also with New Hampshire Humanities.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's really good to see everybody. I'm really excited about this program as well, Nadine, and Archaeology Month. I'm the chair for New Hampshire Humanities. Many of you know and have come to different programs that Plymouth Historical Society has had through New Hampshire Humanities. If you would tell your story, that would be lovely. We have a number of reasons to be able to support New Hampshire Humanities and the NEH. New Hampshire Humanities just lost half of this year's budget that was supposed to come from the federal government. And it was, of course, totally unexpected, but all the humanities programs in the nation are facing that as well. We wouldn't have this. We wouldn't have the community that we have. We wouldn't be the New England tight towns that we are without these kind of gatherings. It's really important that we make sure that our elected representatives, from senators and congresspeople down to the governor, and our elected representatives and the commissioners, I mean, you need to let everybody know that you think this is worth supporting. So, I have a handy-dandy handout that you can read a little bit more about it. And you can also, if you have QR code ability, use the QR code on the back. If you don't, you'll also find the words for the National Humanities Alliance on here. If you go to their website, you can simply click and it will tell them what your zip code is. And it'll be able to connect you not only with our national representatives, but also our state representatives. So I hope you'll support New Hampshire Humanities and the NEH. Thank you.
Typically each year, 3 programs that...
Can I just say one thing, Terry?
Let me just say my little thing and then I'll give it to you, okay? So we typically do 3 programs a year that are funded through with NHH support. And the Peace Public Library, our partner in town, funds three programs through NHH as well. So we might lose 6 programs, the funding for them, and we'll have to scramble. So anyway, that's yeah, Lisa, go ahead.
I just wanted to make sure that everybody realized that PBTV is here recording this tonight.
Oh, yeah.
So if anybody decides that it's too much to stand up for the whole presentation, they will have an option to catch it on PBTV if they like, or to go to YouTube.
Thank you, that's a good point. Yeah, it'll be on the BBTV. Yeah, it's very findable. And I forgot to mention one thing. We're doing, we open the museum on Saturday mornings from the middle of May through the middle of December. And we have volunteer docents that act as guides to the museum and just welcome people and show them around the museum when they come in. And so we're having a training for docents on this coming Saturday, the 19th. And if you're interested in learning more about the history of Plymouth and sharing it with your neighbors in here, don't be intimidated by the idea of having to know everything about Plymouth. You can come in and learn what you need to know, and in helping other people find things, you can teach yourself about what's going on. So it's it's keeping the doors open and keeping someone here so that we can invite people in to see things. So if you want to sign up for that, there's a sign-up sheet on the back table. Looks like this, and I'll just pass this one around, and we can, if that can end up on the back table at the end, that would be great. Okay. So enough of that. I want to introduce our speaker tonight and thank Nadine Miller, the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer with the New Hampshire's Cultural Resource. Oh, right there. Right. So I used to be the forest archaeologist up on the White Mountain for a few years. And back then, 10 or 12 years ago, I worked with Nadine shortly after she got here, I think, or a few years after she got here. And she's been growing into bigger and more responsibilities ever since. And one of the things she was involved in is putting together the contract, I think, for the Cultural Resource Report from Livermore Falls, which shows she's intimately familiar with that project at a variety of levels. And she's driven up from Concord today to be with us and to share her information. I think she's willing to stick around afterwards to chat a little bit. So if there's people who have things they want to share or talk about, Nadine will be here afterwards, and we'll keep the doors open as long as people are interested. There will be food on the table at the end of the program too, so, okay. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Nadine. How's that?
Put it a little closer because now it's a little high. Yes, perfect. That's better. Yes, great. And we're going to turn the lights down too? Yep. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here.
That's not on.
It's not?
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm excited to share some information I've learned about Livermore Falls through my work at the Division of Historical Resources and our sister agency, which is the New Hampshire Parks and Recreation Department. They are the stewards of this area as part of our Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. But I am definitely not the expert on this property, and I heard that there are folks in the audience who probably know more than I do, so I'm really looking forward to hearing from them about their personal experiences. So how many folks here have actually been out to the property? Quite a number, and you've explored and seen some of the ruins and the foundations, and the bridge, of course, is very iconic. And who are the folks who have the real intimate knowledge, who live there, or I've heard, where are they? A couple of folks? Great. That's very exciting, yes. And has anyone actually jumped off that bridge, which is very scary? You have? Oh my gosh, I can't even. So, we're going to get through it, and most of what I'm going to be talking about are what we call cultural landscapes, where we look at our history through a long lens of thousands of years of history. I know that my colleague in the past has done some talks about the archaeology, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the artifacts that were found, but mostly more about the history and the aspect of cultural landscapes. I should hold this. So as mentioned, I'm with the Division of Historical Resources. We are the State Historic Preservation Office. There are 10 of us now. We're part of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, which has the arts and the library, which you've heard about, parks, forests, and lands, and trails. But our division, we do the National Register of Historic Places and the State Register, so you might be familiar with this. I think this property is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We also have the Highway Marker Program that we work with DOT to implement, and right now, while we are not putting up new highway markers, we're focusing on rehabilitating the ones that are not in great shape and repainting them and making sure they're in safe locations. We also administer the Moose Plate Grant Program that helps to rehabilitate historic buildings owned by towns and municipalities. We have other grant programs. We also do survey and inventory of resources. We have our archaeology program in the summer. We also do work on state lands. And one of our biggest components is review and compliance. So whenever there are state funds, permits, and federal permits or licensing, our office will review those projects, and there are about 1,500 a year that 3.5 staff review. So we are very, very busy. We also are impacted by funds lost potentially. 60% of our funding comes from the federal government and 40% is through the state. And right now we are sort of frozen out of getting our federal funding with all of the grant issues that are going on at the federal level. So we are keeping our fingers crossed that things are going to work out. Because we are all very, very passionate about what we do. And so what we do is historic preservation. That's one of the aspects. When I say historic preservation, it's not just the buildings or it's the archaeology, our Native American past. It's the landscapes that are so important to New Hampshire. And we've learned that through the studying and working with folks. It's objects. So what we do first is we study and document. We're looking at the history of a place to understand the sense of place or the object or the landscape. And we work to designate those properties for the National Register or the State Register or as National Historic Landmarks. We work to try and protect those resources through designating local historic districts and zoning rules that help protect resources. We recognize them with moments in history, and often we can do that through interpretive signage or websites or possibly video on camera. And we celebrate those events because it's not just about the place, but it's really about the people. And as was mentioned earlier with the Humanities Council, gathering people together to talk about these things and share our history is really important. So every place has a story to tell. But like any good mystery, these tales require some sleuthing. So I know that there are a few folks in here who've done some of our inventory forms. David over here, and he knows that you got to pull a lot of information together to really understand the history and evolution of a property. And so historians and archaeologists look at a lot of different materials to gather that information. They might start by looking at historic maps. There's many maps through time that they can look at. Aerials, the pine blister rust maps, maps from the 1890s. They would look at secondary sources like town histories that have been written, and we're all the way up to the 20th century. So for us, anything built before 1975 is potentially historic. And that's hard to say. A few years ago, we did a lot of studies. We did a lot of studies on mid-century modern buildings, and we've learned a lot about that. And now we're starting to really look at urban renewal. And actually, tomorrow night at the Historical Society, the State Historical Society in Concord, there's the start of a 4-part series on historic preservation. And the second one is on urban renewal, and I'll be giving that next week. So anyway, we also use primary documents when we can find them, like diaries and other sorts of materials, field guides, architectural guides, city directories. We have our office has a file check online called Emmett, And you can go online now for free onto our website and pull up a GIS database that has all of the inventory forms of 16,000 plus resources in the state that have already been evaluated and reviewed, and that's free to everyone, so I would suggest checking that out. And field investigations, actually going out to the site and taking a look at things. So we often start with our archaeological surveys. If an area has not been previously disturbed, if it might be located next to a water body, there are certain factors that trigger the idea of looking at archaeology. And we don't like to look at archaeology and do digging unless it's absolutely necessary, because once you start digging a site, you've pretty much destroyed the site. So we try and avoid actually digging and gathering information different ways. But archaeology is a systematic attempt to locate, identify, and record the resources that are underground, whether they're archaeological artifacts or features, and understand how people lived through that, since many of the records from thousands of years ago certainly are no longer available to us. And we look at archaeology in different phases, and especially with our review and compliance work, we're trying to make sure that it's very efficiently conducted and it doesn't cost a lot to developers and other folks. So we start out with the phase 1A, where archaeologists will go out and they're actually just walking the property and seeing if there are any areas I've mentioned that have sensitivity for archaeology where they haven't been disturbed yet. But then if they find that there is sensitivity, they'll move on to a phase 1B, where they actually do go and do some testing, test pits and shovel tests and test units. And they are looking for the presence of archaeological material. And if they find that enough to mean something, they then will go through a phase 2 evaluation to determine if that site is actually eligible for the National Register. So every archaeological site they find may not be important enough to be eligible for the National Register. And if it is, and if it's going to be disturbed by a project, a new housing complex or a road, they might do phase 3, which is the data recovery, where they are doing a full research design to learn as much as they possibly can, because they know that that site's going to be destroyed because of the project. So we're also looking at pre-contact or Native American archaeology and the prehistoric past. So we're looking for certain things like arrowheads and chert and hearth features and other types of resources. I know that our Native American past goes back at least 12,000 years or more here. Certainly in other parts of the state it's farther back than that, but we do have a long history of that occupation. And we're also looking at post-contact period archaeology, which is really when Europeans came, and it's that early time period for our state in the 1600s and later. And a lot of times we do see the above ground remnants of those types of properties, whether they're foundations, cellar holes, fence lines are there, and we add our knowledge from the written record with the presence of these features on the landscape to really give us the full story when we're looking at archaeology. And we also look at architecture. And we are looking at things that might give us clues as to when buildings were constructed and how they changed through time. So once we've gathered all of our research materials, we may go out to the site and look at these properties. And certainly our villages with our churches as in libraries and town halls are very iconic. You can tell by the architectural style when a building may have been constructed. A federal style would be very early, and the Greek revival with the columns might be the 1830s through the 60s. I love this gas station, which is in Hooksett. It has not changed at all. And I drive by there and I worry every time I drive by that it's going to be gone, but it's still there. Because we do look at our roadside architecture too, and certainly our bridges and dams, and there are many types of resources that we're looking at, not just the buildings. And rural character is very, very important. When we do studies and we have input for our plan, we ask folks in New Hampshire what's most important to them. And more times than not, it's going to be rural character, the natural environment, how it interacts with the built environment is very, very important. So it's recognizable as part of our heritage, has many, many layers. With our agricultural sites. There's going to be many different stages of clearing and regrowth of the forests, changes to the types of crops and production that we've seen through the years. But certainly I hope that our rural character remains for many years. We just have to work with our towns and our cities to make sure zoning is such where we can preserve those areas. So I want to bring you back to the 1700s because I think a lot of us think that New Hampshire has looked this way forever, but really it hasn't. Certainly in the 1700s, before settlement, we did have the old growth forests that were here. They were really denuded by lumbering, which we'll talk about a little bit later because Livermore Falls is very significant to the lumber industry. But by the 1740s, folks were coming and they were starting to clear the land for homesteads. And so here you can see an example of that with starting to take the rocks from the ground and build the fencing, the stone walls that we see to keep their animals in. And into the 1800s, with the height of agriculture here, you can see that there really were a lot less trees than there are today. It would be really hard to imagine that, I think, if we go out there. But this would also be around the time when sheep farming was a craze here. So again, the stone walls would keep the sheep in, and this is how it looked around that time. But by the 1850s, certainly many of the farmers were moving out to the Midwest. The land was better there for farming. We were starting to denude the soil here, and farm abandonment started to happen. And so we see a lot of the trees and growth, the shrubs start to grow back and take over those farmsteads, and the buildings start to collapse. And by 1910, we had the pine that was coming up, kind of that early growth again. And then by the 1930s, we had the hardwoods again. So this is about the time where we're starting to see our buildings falling down and just the remnants of the foundations and cellar holes left out there. So as I mentioned, what we're looking at in our division, when we look at National Register and State Register properties, setting and landscape is just really important. When I first started working 30 plus years ago, it was all about the architecture of the building, who the architect was, how fancy the building was. That's what was important to people. But what we've learned now, at least up here, is that the building can be important, but it really, how does it sit within the landscape? What are the other man-made features that are important to that property? Whether it's farm fields or the woodlots, etc., the old burial grounds and cemeteries that might be on properties. So we're taking a look now holistically at all of the property, not just the buildings on the property. And I mentioned I threw out the word cultural landscape. So around the time when Northern Pass came around, and I know most of you are very familiar with that time, it wasn't long ago, we were very, very involved with that project. There were many, many resources that were being evaluated because that was a federal undertaking through the Department of Energy. And we were hearing from many people, especially up here in the North Country, that it wasn't just the buildings, it was the landscape. And how can we evaluate our properties so that it collects the landscape as well? And we look to the National Park Service. They have cultural landscape studies and define what a cultural landscape is. And as I mentioned, it really is looking at the layered history. And it's also a product that is prepared not just by a historian or above-ground person, but an archaeologist would be involved, an ethnographer might be involved, a cultural geographer. They're looking at talking with a lot of local folks to really understand the use of land through time, how that use may have changed the landscape, and pulling that together in a broader study, looking at much larger areas. And we identified, I think, at least 6 to 10 cultural landscapes as part of the Northern Pass project. So we have a good basis for understanding how to evaluate those resources. And since then, we've really been trying to look at our landscape much broadly. So now we will get to the project, which is our Livermore Falls. It's near the State Forest, Hampton, Plymouth, and Holderness. It just happens to be at that confluence of the three towns. This is a little dark, but the brown is the Livermore Falls State Forest and the Pimmachuasset River running through there. So originally, the property had about 134 acres of mostly wooded land. And the Forestry Commission in 1916 did get the state forest, and that ended up being part of the Department of Resources and Economic Development, or DRED, which now is the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And as I mentioned, we have both forest and lands and parks. So there was an additional 44-acre section of land that was acquired in 1992 with Land Conservation Investment Program funding. And that is where most of the village or industrial site is located, as well as the New Hampshire's first fish hatchery, which we're going to talk about as well. But before that, we'll really go back to Native American occupation. Our office was involved with this site around 2015, 2014, when Parks received some extra money to formalize the parking area and to turn this into a little bit more of a traditional state park rather than just an area where people came and went. And so we were able to do some archaeological studies and some above-ground studies. We hired a consultant to do that work, but then we continued to do that work ourselves as part of our summer program. So it seemed that along the river here, the Native Americans did find this location with the falls very intriguing. They had the spawning season with the fish, and it was a great location to procure and process salmon and other fish as they were moving around here. And what we've also found through our studies, and as I mentioned, we have both in this area, the pre-contact Native American sites we've identified, as well as the European sites that we've identified. So these previous archaeological studies we conducted show a couple of things. What we call lithic assemblages, which are the stone tools and their cutting and chips that they would do when they were traveling through the area and cutting so they could do hunting. And oftentimes at the same time, they would build a fire for their food and for the fish. And so we were able to also find a hearth that was related to that activity at this site. And the hearth feature, we mentioned that we're thinking it goes back around 2,800 years ago when the fish were caught along the river and they cooked or smoked it upon a platform of rocks that had been placed upon a bed of hot coals. And when they're looking at archaeology, they can see the changing colors of the soil because they're looking at stratigraphy. They go down very, very slowly. And when you can see this level of the charcoal, then they know that there was likely a resource that was associated with a hearth. Archaeology is really interesting and we learn a lot, but it's also something that we do keep confidential. So our database that's available online does have thousands of resources that are above ground, but we also have archaeological sites. But you can only look at those if you are an archaeologist and have permission to look for the archaeology sites. We worry often about looting and other sorts of things, so we have to protect those sites. So what we've learned about Livermore Hollow, Livermore Falls, is that the European settlement started around the mid-1700s up to today. And it was a lot of devastation with fires and flooding. It seemed to be fires and flooding for years. But in 1769, it was Moses Little who built a grist and lumber mill. And that family was one of the earliest families there before the Livermores got there a little bit later. We had a tanning factory there. We had a number of pulp mills associated with the logging industry, a casket company, and a later pulp mill in our village that was here. So early settlement, as I mentioned, was the 1760s. Within the project, it was Moses Little who settled the falls. We believe that he built several mills at the falls, and at least one store. And in 1797, he passed this on to the Livermore family, and then to the Durgin family, and subsequently to the Holmes family. The mills were situated in the flat floodplain areas on the east side of the river, just downstream of the falls, which became the Hollow. And around 1786 is when Judge Arthur Livermore acquired the property and its milling operations. And it took a little time. It was originally called Little Falls, but changed over to Livermore Falls by the early 1800s. And we found that in the early 1800s, that was when the small community really began at the Hollow. It had about 10 houses, a schoolhouse, a couple of stores. But in 1820, all of the mills and the dam were washed out in a severe flood. So that was sort of the start of rebuilding damage, rebuilding damage. So here is the 1816 map. And if you can see, sort of right by the O in Holderness, it says Honorable A. Livermore's seat. So he was one of the earliest settlers there. And then you see the littles too. So these are one of the examples of looking at early historic maps so that we can understand people who lived through time and the types of industries that were there. So these are fun to look at. And a lot of these maps are online if you do enough digging. And I'm sure the Historical Society has a lot of them as well. So we will start talking a little bit about the state fish hatchery. I think fish hatcheries are really interesting, and we have a number of them still today. They are a unique component of our history in New Hampshire. But this was the first one, and it was started in the early to mid-1800s. It was also on that flat area on the east side of the river. And industrial development along the New England's rivers really impacted Atlantic salmon runs. It was the industry, it was the pollution that was in there, it was the dams specifically that were being built so that they were not able to go up to their spawning areas. And those dams were important for our water power for mills. So the number of salmon were really dwindling in the Merrimack River, almost to extinction by 1850. So Massachusetts actually partnered up with New Hampshire, and they organized a fisheries commission as early as 1865 to restore Atlantic salmon to the Merrimack. And we were lucky to find these wonderful etchings of that fish hatchery circa 1880, which is really early. So in the January of 1874, the commissioners began discussions about constructing a hatchery near the headwaters of the Connecticut or Merrimack River. They were looking at both places. And over the next 2 years, the idea came about to create this commission and to work together to establish that hatchery. So in 1877, they agreed to erect the facility here at the springs at Livermore Falls. And the construction began immediately by October 1877. The hatchery was ready to receive its first batch of salmon eggs with the salmon hatch house and holding pond that were constructed. So the hatchery was built. They were planning and they used these nets to capture the adult salmon at the falls and transplant them into the holding ponds. When they matured, they would artificially spawn the fish. And unfortunately, in 1877, when they first started to work here, there were no salmon eggs available anywhere. So the first eggs were hatched from a Chinook salmon from California. They shipped them off. So we have 1877. By 1888, the fish hatchery suffered a fire on the afternoon in March. There was a defective flue, and the hatch house burned with all of the eggs inside. So they decided to rebuild the hatchery by August of 1888. Construction was underway. It was going to be twice the size of the original, and the new hatch house had a capacity of 2 million eggs. So the result of this early attempt to restore salmon runs proved less than ideal, unfortunately. Despite many passages of laws requiring installation of fish ladders at dam sites, they really didn't help the salmon, and the numbers didn't come back as much as they'd hoped. Also, there were some periods of droughts and floods which hampered their recovery, pollution, as I mentioned, siltation, lack of adequate fish passages. So the fish hatchery only remained in service until 1907, and then it was moved to Laconia. And so we still have a number of fish hatcheries today that the New Hampshire Fish and Game run, and they are working actually on one of their fish hatcheries. They received some federal monies to do some rebuilding, and I know that they would like to open a small museum to make it more accessible to the public. So that would be great when they were able to do that. But here is a picture of the fish hatchery today, the area that it was in. There's very little left. There's nothing left really above ground. I think there's one pipe that might be there that you can see, but not much visually. Then we're going to move to the bridges, because that's another component that I think identifies this area, at least for folks who are not from here and know much about it. They look at the bridge that's there and think, wow. But that was not the first bridge that was located in the area. The gorge has seen a number of bridges since that initial settlement period in the late 18th century. So we have the earlier bridge from 1875 that was a wooden truss bridge. But the actual early bridge started around 1788, and that one was paid for by subscription of the folks who lived in Little's area, and it was helpful to spur on some of the development. But again, that bridge functioned for a little while and then was fallen down. Many of these wooden bridges are just not going to last a long time. So when Livermore got there, he built some replacement bridges and worked with the town to get some money. The quote I have here is, the town paid Livermore $500 for the structure in 1820, which he warranted for 16 years against all destruction save by fire. Livermore's bridge survived only a few days before a severe flood in 1820 of October carried the bridge away and abandoned the mills. So here we go again. So a new bridge was built in 1839. By 1869, that one was gone, and we have another bridge for about 15 years. And then this is the one that we think was from 1869. This is the same bridge, it's just two different periods. The original period, it's a howe truss, and the trusses were exposed, but later on they covered them with wood to protect them. But the bridge that we see today is built by the Berlin Iron Bridge Company. They were out of Ohio, and I think they were getting tired of the wooden bridges that were lasting only a few years, and this was a time period in the 1880s when metal truss bridges were really popular and lasted much longer. So they contacted the Berlin Iron Bridge Company to construct the lenticular truss bridge, which is out there. And it is a lenticular truss, which is a Pratt truss, but it has a curving at the up and the bottom chords. And this one was built of wrought iron. Some of these bridges involve cast iron later. It spanned the gorge at a height of 103 feet above the river, and it had two deck spans that totaled 263 feet in length. So like other bridges that were built by this company, they would have prefabricated the materials at the shops in Ohio and shipping them out there, usually by train. We've got the tracks that are near there, following specifications provided by the customer. And so, as I mentioned, they loaded them into railroad cars and moved them out there and assembled them piece by piece. So here's a couple of historic pictures of the bridge early on. I like these pictures because when you pass there, you think, boy, how did people drive across that? But this is a great image of the folks just walking across the bridge. And so for the bridge, at the time, all three towns contributed to the bridge's maintenance. But of course, as the size and weight of automobiles increased over time, the number of vehicles on the bridge was limited at any given time. So in 1953, the bridge was reduced to one lane. They removed these original railings and they put new railings closer together so that they only could have the one lane. But in 1959, DOT, State Department of Transportation at the time, said that the bridge was unsafe and they permanently closed it to traffic. And then shortly after, a scrap dealer cut the east span and dropped it into the gorge. And some of the remaining railings and the decking were also removed at this time. And I know our department started looking at this because we don't actually know who owns the bridge. It's not owned by the state. The towns are not accepting responsibility. Right. So we started looking at, what would we need to do if we needed to remove any component of it. But that bridge is just so heavy, and the way it's fallen into the side there, it was too costly and unsafe to handle. So show you a picture of how it is today. And as I mentioned, some folks, how did you get up there?
Walk. Go out on the other side, and you go up on the other side of the bridge. Down this way would be on the right-hand side. There's a little trail that goes up back, and there's like one single tree that's only like 12 feet high. So you could do that for a beginner warm-up round, about 80 feet, but then after that, you get up on the top and then go for it.
Well, I'm not recommending anybody do that, so forget what I said. All right, so I mentioned logging. Logging is definitely a major component at this site, but also so much of our history in New Hampshire, logging played such a significant role. We saw some of the early pictures at the pre-settlement time in the late 1600s when our tall trees were very of interest to England, and so with the large sailing ships and the masts, they used the white pines for that purpose. And so timber removal started as early as the 1600s, lasted through the turn of the 20th century, all up and down the Connecticut River and north into Berlin and other parts of the state. And here is a picture of the Livermore Falls area with the river drivers moving logs through the river, an early picture from 1860. So a little history about that. During the early 1800s, Nicholas Norcross, he was the king of lumber in the Northeast. He built a sawmill on the Merrimack River in Lowell, Massachusetts. And he eventually had to search farther and farther to find timber. His land agent, Samuel Walker, went up the river, Pimichet River Valley, and purchased land at the headwaters of the east branch of the river. During the winter of 1844-45, loggers began seeking choice white pine and sometimes spruce near the river. During the spring of 1846, the drivers initiated the first movement of pine logs along the river down to Lowell. And Norcross's Merrimack River Lumber Company employed a winter crew of about 150 men and 35 oxen, and records show that in 1852, loggers drove 10 to 12 million board feet of timber down the river. So white pine did remain the preferred species until about the Civil War era, when those numbers declined, and then they turned their eyes toward red spruce as a replacement for the white pine, and that became the jewel of the valley. Of course, those numbers declined, and that was pretty much the end of logging for the most part. I'm okay if you want to keep that light down.
You're okay?
I can see,
Okay.
yes. And so for the Merrimack River Lumber Company on the Pimichet River, it was around 1883 when they had the last drive down the river. So I love this picture. It was one I used at the very front. We have some great images, not only of the buildings that were there and the landscape, but of the people. So according to period newspaper reports, there was a tannery that was located in the hollow. We're not sure which of these buildings, if it was in the photo or outside of the photo, there was actually a tannery. But tanneries did often go hand in hand with the lumber industry because they used those byproducts for making the leather. But little information is available for the history of the business, but Heath and Sons may have built the tannery around 1875. That's why we have this great picture of the bridge as well. And at some point, they sold the bridge business to the Dearborn brothers, who operated it until it burned in 1894. So a photograph from the 1870s or 80s shows the tannery, but we're not sure. But it did rely heavily on deer hides, and in the photo, there are a number of men who are holding those deer hides. I think you can see the guy, the third from the right, holding that. So this leads us from lumbering to the industrial history of the site. And given the state's vast timber reserves, it was no surprise that lumber and paper really contributed to the economy of New Hampshire back in the day. As early as the colonial era, sawmills, grist mills, cider mills constituted the bulk of the region's industrial output. The state's first paper mill started operations in 1793. And by 1936, lumber mills and paper mills accounted for approximately 20% of employment throughout the whole state of New Hampshire. At the same time, New Hampshire was the 8th largest producer of paper and wood pulp manufacturing in the whole country. Wow. So here we have an image, sort of a grainy image, but we can start to see what was taking place in the late 1800s. The water power at the falls site attracted numerous industries over the years. The tannery I mentioned, a shingle mill, a number of pulp mills through time. And a pulp mill is a manufacturing facility that transforms wood chips or other plant fibers into a thick fiber board known as pulp, which is then used in paper mills to produce paper and related products. So again, when we were doing our archaeological study in the cultural landscape, we were able to use these photos to see what buildings matched up on maps and through the written record to figure out what they were. One of the first pulp mills was Arthur Holman's Pulp Mill, which was circa November of 1888. And again, the historical record of milling is incomplete, but it looks like that he was the first one. By November of that year, his mill was grinding pulp, and here's another sad story. His mill operated for less than a year. A fire in February of 1889 destroyed the building and all its equipment. And you can really see how substantial that building was. You can see it specifically on the left, and you can see it on the right, sort of in the center of the photograph as well. So, but again, all wood construction in this area, so that caught on fire really quickly and quickly burned without ability to put that out. And here are the ruins in 1889, right after, which just has the lumber left and no building there, but the bridge is still there. So what came after that was the Fiberwood, as I mentioned, Fiberwood company. So by August of 1889, Alden and Woods had completed plans for a new pulp mill at Livermore Falls. Called the Fiberwood Company, the mill's main building measured 45 by 80 feet, stood 3 stories in height. The boiler house, which you can see on the left with the tower, measured 45 by 50 feet and stood 2 stories in height. Fiberwood utilized a portion of the existing mill foundation to support their powerhouse. The new mill was slightly larger than Holman's. The cost of construction was estimated at $16,000, required 90 days to build. By April 1890, Fiberwood was receiving orders for pulp caskets. Much like the milling operation earlier, the Fiberwood Company met with early disaster. In late October, the mill's new dry house burned. The company quickly built a new dry house and was soon back in operation. It continued to manufacture pulp caskets and soon added carriage panels to its inventory, and it employed from 25 to 30 individuals. And here's another great picture of some of the workers at the Fiberwood Company around 1890. So pressed pulp caskets were in demand during the early 1890s. The Eastern Lignoid Casket Company incorporated in February 1893 and established a mill next to Fiberwood Company. We're not sure if they were related or a subsidiary of Fiberwood or just a separate entity. A newspaper article from June 1st of 1893 noted that the company had sold 12 carloads of pulp in a week and were now in the process of pressing caskets. Fiberwood and Eastern Lignoid met their end in 1894 when fire destroyed the mill, as well as the tannery that was nearby. The local paper noted that neither Eastern Lignoid nor Fiberwood had been very successful, but both had provided employment to local residents. The loss of these businesses really marked the end of milling operations at the falls until about 1901. So here is an 1892 map I had mentioned when we can look at some of these maps, especially online, and you can see at the very bottom the Fiberwood Company. But it was around 1901 when J.B. Henry & Sons completed its pulp mill, and that's on the west side of the river, opposite and upstream of the former Fiberwood and Eastern Lignoid Casket Company mills. And I mentioned that since 1901, there were no more mills that were built on the east side of the river. And this is what we see a lot of the remnants today on the west side of the river, but this is what it looked like originally. It had a timber crib dam, which was located immediately upstream of the mill, and it provided the necessary water power for driving the mill's machinery. The water flowed through a head race on the upstream side of the mill and then dropped down through a group of 3 turbines before exiting the tail race at the downstream side of the building. Machinery within the mill included a pair of grinders for making pulp from wood. It also included a presser for forming the pulp into mats, which were then shipped by rail to the paper mill at Lincoln. And Henry had his main plant at Lincoln, and there's a lot of great information about that plant online. So in addition to water power, the mill maintained a steam engine for powering various pieces of machinery. Bark and wood ends from the debarking process provided a ready-made fuel source for the steam engine's boiler. Electric-powered pumps moved the pulp from the lower levels of the mill to the upper floors, where the presser compacted and folded the pulp into mats. The wood used in the pulping process arrived at the mill in 2 to 4 foot lengths. Both the wood for the pulping process and the finished mats of pulp arrived into part of the mill via the adjacent Pemigewasset Valley branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad, which is on the left-hand side of the mill. Yes. So after clear cutting much of the timbers in the area, Henry sold his mill to the Parker Young Company in 1917. Parker and Young operated the mill until 1946, when they sold it to Marcellus Manufacturing Company. They entered bankruptcy in April of 1949. The corporation that owned the mill property renamed it the Franconia Paper Corporation. In 1953, Franconia closed the mill without notice. The company cited rising costs due to the manufacture of pulp at a remote location removed from the paper mill itself. The mill's dam remained intact until 1973, when it was destroyed by a flood. This is an earlier flood. Throughout its history, the number of employees at the mill varied from about 17 to 32. The mill typically operated 24 hours a day with 3 shifts of 8 hours. To provide additional employment during the Great Depression, the mill temporarily switched to 4 shifts of 6 hours. Working around the clock, the mill could process about 1 boxcar load of pulp every day. It operated year-round, but low water sometimes forced temporary shutdowns. During these periods, the men either made repairs to the machinery or they went to work at the paper mill in Lincoln. So this is an example of what we see today. Following the mill's closure, the property transferred to Livermore Falls Corporation. In January 1979, Livermore Falls Corporation sold the property to North Stratford Equipment Corporation. The mill itself had been heavily vandalized, as we can see, in the years following its closure. During the early 60s and 70s, someone salvaged the red bricks that comprised the mill's walls, leaving only the granite foundation and brick head wall. The timber crib dam that provided the reservoir for the mill's water power was succumbed to flood in 1973. And as I mentioned, using the Land Conservation Investment Program funding in 1992, we were able at the state to acquire this portion of the property as well. And I think through time we've talked about ways to make this a little bit safer, to maybe have some viewing areas. So if we end up having funding at any point in time, that would be a nice goal as stewards of the property. So basically, we're back to 1916 here, because by the early 20th century, the years of unregulated deforestation had left much of the surrounding landscape in ruins. The lumber barons, such as J.E. Henry, who acquired vast tracts of timber, which they felled for lumber and pulp for paper, they kind of abandoned the area. So concerned for the scenic beauty and long-term sustainability of the lumber history and industry, the state of New Hampshire began acquiring tracts of timber to prevent further destruction of the natural resources in our state. And in 1916, the New Hampshire Forestry and Recreation Department acquired much of the current Livermore State Forest Department. When the state acquired the property, the Forestry Department took measures to promote the growth of white pine and hemlock. With the closure of the mills, the falls became available for other uses. Among the numerous possible uses discussed by a Livermore Falls Gorge Study Commission in the 70s was a proposal to harness the water power of the falls to produce electricity. In 1990, the North Stratford Equipment Corporation studied the feasibility of building a hydro facility, but decided they never progressed more than just planning. And I mentioned during recent years, Parks and Rec utilizing federal funds to formalize the recreation site, upgrade the parking area, and this prompted the need for the archaeological studies that provided a lot more information on the site. So I just wanted to kind of run through, it sounds like a lot of you guys have been to the site, but those who haven't, some of the foundations that are still there, and again, by matching them up to historic photographs and to mapping, and doing a lot of measuring of the resource that's left, we can tell that this area was part of the Fiberwood Company, part of the mill foundation, and this is facing northeast. This is also part of the foundation, and when you look out, it was a site of the former mill dam. But you can see the fairly substantial stone materials that made up the foundation. Another mill foundation facing southeast. You can see the corners where the building was there. This is part of the Lignoid Casket Company foundation nearby. And another example here. Another example. And one of the other foundations in the hollow at the time, we hadn't identified what it was, but we've done a lot more studies and have learned a lot more about the site since. So I love this saying. So what we were very fortunate to be able to work with a lady who had lived there in her youth, and her name is Abby Frizzell, and she provided us with an oral history. And she spoke very lovingly of living there, and she explained, and the lawn and the lilacs were right there, and the barn was there, and this was all fields and whatnot. I have a copy of the transcript that we have, and I'm providing that to the Historical Society on my thumb drive here, because she really does talk about, even though they didn't have a lot of money, the site location and the housing was not the best quality. The family was very close because of that. So we were trying to figure out through our archaeological studies how many houses were at that site and how many foundations matched up to those houses. So I'm going to pull my notes here. And you can see again by looking at that earlier photograph I mentioned, there were at least 4, but we know that there were likely more than that. Earlier studies set up to 10, but we think we found about 4 to 6. They were likely residences for the mill families. And here we can look at a cellar hole that's on the landscape on the left and match it up specifically to the house in the photograph that it was part of. So this is what's a lot of fun about sleuthing and doing historic preservation, is to figure out how things were originally. And so again, the picture on the right, the house on the right in the back, was that house. And the foundation was likely the gable part on the right-hand side. And so these types of houses, which you call side hall house forms, were typically from the mid-19th century. Oftentimes they have a Greek revival details, and most of them were constructed of wood. So you can see a very similar style with the gable front that we see throughout the region. These were very typical houses with the side additions and L's for the kitchen and woodshed, etc. And so while we were doing our testing, we certainly found some interesting artifacts of the period. A lot of building construction materials, glass. Of course, when the buildings fall down or torn down, you'll have a lot of glass and nails, other sorts of metal objects that the houses were made of. You see a button here. So we did find quite a number of different types of construction materials. And here's some more hardware that we found. And so when we're doing archaeology, we collect all of this while we're out in the field in bags. We mark which stratigraphy we found them. And when we come back to our lab in Concord, we have a number of volunteers who help our state archaeologists clean the artifacts and number them and save them so that future researchers could gather information. I see on the right a spring. Maybe that was part of a mattress at some point in time. But it's kind of fun to look through that and figure out what that is.
Is that a sword in there?
Let's see where I'm here.
Sword?
I don't think so. It looks like there's pieces that kind of have, kind of make it look like that. But sometimes it's very hard to know exactly what those pieces are because they've corroded through time. They might just be pieces of larger objects. And we're gathering all of even the smallest bits of materials when we're doing our archaeology. We also found quite a number of personal items. Clay pipe on the left. Pipes were very common, and we do find those often, particularly for sites that are around the 1800s. And a World War I trench lighter on the right, which is great. So we'll clean those up and measure those. And we can often find what these things are, too, again, by looking at different antique guides on the internet. Those are very helpful for us to understand what these resources were. And here's a great image of a man using a pipe just like that on the right. And we also found domestic items, so a lamp base, and I'm sure my great grandmother had a meat grinder. So when you folks sit here, I kind of wish we still had them because that would be great, but here's another example of that. We also, I didn't take a picture, but in one of the foundations found a leather, a sole of a shoe. So many interesting things that kind of tell us that this was everyday life here at this village. We found these 1890s Liberty dimes, an inkwell. So we had folks who could have been collecting coins, writing diaries and things, and having nice items that any folks would have in any village setting in town. As I mentioned, we have the oral history, and she came out to the site and talk with our archaeologist, David Truby, on the right, with the facilitator, because when you're doing oral history, you really want to make sure the person is comfortable, you are transcribing everything, so we have it on record. And she took them around the whole site, especially where her house was, and talked specifically about her memories there. She even was able to provide some and this is the house that they lived in. So this was by the time when it was the Parker and Young Company in the early 20th century. And she said there was no insulation, no running water, no electricity, and they paid $8 a month to live there. And this was, they called, the last house that was still standing in the hollow. And so there are other oral histories that are available here, and this just shows some evidence of, it says the company, which was Parker and Young, had 5 houses which it rented to employees. These houses were on the opposite side of the river and cost $8 a month, and it was later raised to $10 a month. When the factory closed, they were torn down, 3 of the houses, and it says that, what did he say? Tore down 3 of the houses and built his present home from these. So there could be some materials and some homes above there. And why is this not here? Well, there is one more slide, and I don't want to miss it. What? There we go. Okay, we'll just leave it like this. So, as I mentioned, with the division, our Department of Natural and Cultural Resources and Parks and Recreation, they want to be good stewards of the property. It's an area you can go down, obviously, now, and you can have picnics and be in the river. And so we were able to get some money to do a nice interpretive sign that talks a little bit more about the area with some of our historic images, talking about the mills and the lumber industry. So I kind of asked, how else do we honor our history here? You know, we like to use this information sometimes for websites. Historical societies are great at gathering all of that. Talking to you all, and so I would love to definitely hear some more stories as I end it here. If anybody would like to share anything that they have, memories or more information, like I said, I'll be here and love to hear more. We are always gathering information and can learn more, so thank you.